It's not every day you find an unfamiliar woman with a leopard print cooler, a fold-out chair, and a six-pack of White Claws parked inside your cattle pasture, especially not when she's chest-deep in your private fishing pond like she owns the place. I didn't even know she was there until one of my cows mooed in that specific, irritated way they reserve for trespassers, and I looked out the kitchen window to see what looked like a rejected Real Housewives audition trying to reel in a base from my shoreline. She had torn through a section of my wooden fence, ripped it out like a bear clawed through it, and dragged a cheap spinning rod and a Bluetooth speaker into the middle of my land. The bass were biting, the pop music was loud, and Karen looked like she had declared squatters' rights on my pond. I watched her from my porch for a solid 5 minutes, sipping coffee, not quite believing any of it was real. I thought about calling the sheriff, but I live in a rural part of Georgia where the deputies take their time unless there's blood or fire involved. And honestly, I wanted to see how far she'd take it. When I finally walked down the slope toward her, she didn't even flinch. She glanced over her shoulder, didn't recognize me, and went back to casting like I was the one on her property. She looked about 50, tan in that overbaked way that suggested most of her outdoor experience came from tanning beds and HOA poolside gossip session. Her straw hat had a neon pink ribbon. Her t-shirt read "Lake Life is the best life" in glitter. And when I said, very calmly, "Ma'am, you're trespassing on private property," she rolled her eyes so hard I thought she'd sprain her neck. "Oh, relax," she huffed, like I was inconveniencing her. "You're being dramatic. It's just fishing. You don't even have a gate. And I was told this pond was public." I stared at the hole in my fence, and then at her inflatable unicorn floaty half-beached near the waterline. "It's on my land," I said. "There's a no trespassing sign every 30 feet. She gestured at the fence she'd broken. "Well, your fence was in the way. Maybe if you built it better, people wouldn't walk right through." Now, I'll admit something here. I should have been mad. A normal person would have yelled or threatened legal action. But something about her confidence, like she genuinely believed this pond was hers to enjoy, like private property laws were optional suggestions, struck me as too absurd to meet with anger. This was theater. A performance, and I wanted to see the whole show. "Interesting logic," I said. "And who exactly told you this was public?" She waved her hand vaguely toward the road. "The woman with the clipboard. Karen runs the HOA. I live in the new development over there." She pointed toward the row of identical beige McMansions half a mile away, and she said we had access to all community amenities, including the lake. "The pond," I corrected. She didn't like that. "Same thing. It's not. This isn't part of your HOA. This is a privately owned agricultural plot that I've held since my grandfather passed. It's not in your development, and it's not an amenity." She scoffed. "Well, that's ridiculous. You don't even use it. And it's beautiful. It should be for everyone." There it was. The entitlement I'd heard about but rarely witnessed firsthand. The belief that anything used by someone else was free for the taking. I knew then that this wasn't a one-off. It wasn't just a lady with bad judgment and sun damage. This was the opening act of a drama that had probably been brewing ever since that HOA sprouted up like fungus on the edge of my land. Sure enough, when I asked around the next day, I found out she wasn't just some random trespasser. Her name was Melody Hardwick. She was the younger sister of Karen Donnelly, the HOA president from hell, and together they'd been spreading the story that my pond, yes, my pond, was legally accessible to the whole community. Karen had even drawn up a fake amenities map that labeled my fishing pond as shared waterfront space. They had printed it in the HOA newsletter, in full color. At first, I laughed. It was so outrageously, cartoonishly wrong. But when I called my county clerk's office to clarify boundaries, I learned that the HOA had filed an easement request, claiming historic use of the pond going back 6 months. 6 months ago was when Karen's HOA was founded. Historic indeed. The clerk laughed too. But he added something else. "They're pushing hard on this one," he said. "They already had a civil attorney call in. You might want to get a lawyer before this gets weird." That was the moment I realized this wasn't absurd anymore. It wasn't funny. It was real. Karen and Melody weren't just entitled. They were organized. They had a plan, and it involved bullying me off my own property with enough paperwork and posturing that I'd either give in or go broke fighting it. So I did the only logical thing a man with a petty streak and a pond could do. I got serious. And a little bit evil. You see, I'd spent the last few years slowly turning that pond into something special. I dug it deeper, stocked it with native fish, even introduced aquatic plants to balance the ecosystem. But if the HOA wanted to play games with my water, I could upgrade the stakes. I reached out to a local aquarium supplier I knew from college. He'd gone into exotic species logistics, mostly legal, and asked a question I never thought I'd seriously say out loud. "How hard is it to get electric eels?" He paused on the phone. "For a petting tank or for vengeance?" I told him vengeance. 3 weeks later, 5 juvenile electric eels, all legally imported with the right permits, arrived in discreet water containers. I eased them into a shallow, mucky corner of the pond where they'd have space to feed and grow. They were surprisingly easy to care for. They liked live food, murky waters, and being left the hell alone. And while that part of the pond slowly turned into a living security system, I printed new signs. Not boring ones. Big splashy ones. Danger. Electrified water. Authorized personnel only. Severe risk of shock. They were dramatic and a little ridiculous, perfect for deterring the nosy, the curious, and especially the Karens of the world. Of course, I couldn't legally shock anyone. That would be a problem. But the truth is, the eels wouldn't hurt a soul unless provoked. And my new signs didn't say humans would be shocked. Just that something in the water might. It was all technically true. Legally ambiguous. And very, very fun. So when Melody came back 2 weeks later, this time with a folding canopy, 2 friends, and what looked like a picnic basket, I simply watched from my porch, sipping lemonade. I saw her spot the signs, scoff at them, and walk straight past. And when she screamed 5 minutes later, just as her bare leg brushed the shallows near the eel nest, it was all I could do not to fall out of my chair laughing. It turns out that electric eels don't just shock. They hum. Not a musical hum, more like a low, vibrating growl if you get close enough. The pond had become a living amplifier, and once Melody learned the hard way that she couldn't just go wading in like it was Club Med, word started spreading faster than a Georgia brushfire. Within 2 days, her HOA newsletter went from calling the pond a shared community oasis, to warning residents to use caution near potentially hazardous wildlife. No apology. No retraction. Just a subtle pivot and a full-color photo of Melody's bandaged ankle paired with a passive-aggressive reminder that nature must be respected. Of course, Karen didn't take it lying down. The eel incident humiliated her sister, and Karen's type doesn't handle embarrassment well. They channel it, weaponize it, turn it into a mission wrapped in legality and scented with lavender essential oils. The next time I saw her, she was marching down my gravel drive in wedge sandals and a fitted blazer like she was there to foreclose on a bank. Behind her followed 2 board members and a man who introduced himself as legal counsel retained by the HOA. I didn't invite them past the gate. They didn't ask. Karen started with a smile. That tight-lipped, plastic sort of grin that usually precedes a cease and desist letter or a pyramid scheme pitch. "Good afternoon," she said, clearly pretending this was a civilized visit. "We've had some confusing reports about an aggressive aquatic species in the community lake." "You mean my pond?" I asked, leaning against the post where she'd parked her clipboard. She didn't blink. "There seems to be a potential safety concern. Several residents feel threatened. We're just here to make sure everything's compliant with county regulations." I glanced at the man beside her, the so-called legal counsel, who was already sweating through his linen shirt and fumbling with a thick manila folder. "I'd be happy to discuss regulations," I said, "after you show me a warrant. Otherwise, this is still private property." Karen's smile twitched, but she stayed in character. "We're not here to cause trouble." "Then leave." The man in the linen shirt cleared his throat. "We're just hoping to clarify the zoning dispute. There's a petition underway. If the body of water in question qualifies as a shared natural feature under Subdivision Clause B14, we could argue for easement designation. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I am the kind of person who reads every contract he signs. When the HOA was incorporated, I made sure none of their jurisdiction touched my land. But what I didn't account for, what none of us rural holdouts did, was the HOA's appetite for expansion. Their maps were starting to include properties they didn't own, claiming historical access, based on nothing more than backyard gossip and poorly drawn flyers. "You can petition all you want," I said. "That pond was built by my grandfather before most of those houses even had plumbing. It's been private for 3 generations. You want it? Buy it." Karen didn't like that answer. She let the clipboard fall to her side and took a slow step forward, lowering her voice like we were co-conspirators. "Look, I get it. You're attached to this place. But you could make things a lot easier for everyone if you just shared a little. We want to create a harmonious community. You wouldn't have to give it up. Just open it on weekends. Maybe allow kayak access. We'd handle the insurance, even put your name on a plaque. You want to rename my pond? Karen Donnelly Lakefront Preserve has a lovely ring to it." I laughed. Loudly. Probably too loudly. The legal guy stepped back like he thought I might lunge. But all I did was nod slowly and say, "Tell you what. You file whatever paper you want. But you come back on my land without permission again, and the only thing you'll be preserving is your court date." She stormed off, stilettos clicking on my gravel like gunfire. But I knew that wasn't the end. Karen wasn't a storm. She was erosion, slow, relentless, and petty. The next few weeks were like playing chess against a raccoon with a typewriter. Nothing made sense, but everything was annoying. Suddenly, I had county inspectors showing up unannounced. Code enforcement left me notes about unregistered exotic wildlife. The county even sent a tax reassessment notice trying to classify my pond as commercial usage. Someone anonymously reported me for operating a recreational facility without a permit. And each time I handled it, filed the right forms, explained the situation. But I could feel the pressure building. Karen was squeezing me from every angle that didn't require trespassing. Then came the drones. The HOA had apparently decided that if they couldn't physically inspect my pond, they'd take to the skies. I first noticed it at sunrise, this quiet, mosquito-like buzzing overhead. A quadcopter with a wide-angle lens hovered just long enough to get a full aerial scan before zipping back toward the development. The next day it came back, and the next. Sometimes it brought friends. I knew better than to shoot them down. That's a fast track to a felony. But I did the next best thing. I painted a giant eel on an old bedsheet with red lightning bolts and the words "Live Shock Feeding Zone" in all caps. Then I staked it next to the pond in perfect line of sight for the drone's camera. A few more fake wires, a blinking light or two scavenged from an old solar panel kit, and boom! I had a convincing prop that looked like a sci-fi torture device. The drones stopped coming after 3 days. But Karen? She escalated. The final straw came during a weekend I was away at my niece's graduation. I'd left the property secured, cameras rolling, and my neighbor Roy on casual watch. When I got home, I found tire tracks across my lower pasture. Deep ruts from what looked like an ATV or utility cart. One section of fence had been removed, cleanly, like someone had used tools, not brute force. And near the pond there were folding chairs, coolers, trash, the remains of what looked like a full-on picnic. And the water was stirred. Murky. Disrupted. as if someone had tried to wade in again. One of my warning signs had been ripped clean off its post and tossed into the brush. The footage told the story. Karen's nephew, some gangly teenager with an undercut and a GoPro, had led a group of neighborhood kids on a pond challenge. They dared each other to jump in, to hunt for the eels, and worst of all, to try to catch one. At one point, the video caught a kid holding a net and poking at the shallows. The eels didn't attack, thank God. But they clearly scattered, stressed and swimming erratically. And then the nephew said something that chilled me. Aunt Karen says if we make it look unsafe enough, the county will shut it down. She said the more complaints we get, the more leverage the HOA has. They weren't just trying to take the pond anymore. They were trying to sabotage it. That's when I stopped playing defense. They wanted to mess with my eels? Fine. I'd give them something worth complaining about. Something that couldn't be ignored or spun with legalese. Something that would force them to back off without me ever touching a single one of them. And I knew exactly how to do it. The first step was upgrading my permit. I called in a favor with a buddy who worked at the State Department of Natural Resources. Told him I needed official documentation for exotic species on agricultural property, with language specific enough to scare off any nosy neighbors with an overactive legal team. After reviewing the footage from the kids' pond stunt, he not only agreed but offered something even better, a protected habitat designation. Turns out electric eels are rare enough in controlled outdoor environments to warrant special observation status, especially when they're healthy and successfully acclimating. With that new classification, I wasn't just some guy with a private pond anymore. I was the steward of a recognized habitat. By the time Karen received a certified letter from the state agency informing her that her HOA members were in violation of conservation laws for harassing protected aquatic wildlife, the damage had already been done, socially, anyway. I posted the full pond challenge footage to a local Facebook group, complete with screen grabs of her nephew poking around with a net and her HOA badge clearly visible on a clipboard in the background. I didn't add commentary. I didn't accuse anyone. I just captioned it, "Wildlife Harassment Incident on Private Land." Any idea who this kid is? It went semi-viral in our county by lunchtime. Melody tried to comment that it was harmless fun, but by then, the conservationists had found the thread. They weren't amused. Neither were the HOA's more respectable members, many of whom hadn't realized how aggressive Karen's pond grab campaign had become. Some of them started asking questions. Others quietly removed themselves from the HOA Facebook page altogether. A few brave souls even emailed me directly to apologize. That might have been enough for some people, but I'd lived next to this HOA long enough to know Karen wasn't done. She never quit when she lost. She just changed tactics. So I decided to change mine, too. No more defensive maneuvers. No more passive signs and clever little warnings. If Karen wanted this war, I was going to end it with the one thing she'd never be able to spin, ignore, or fight against. Full-blown, high-visibility, publicly adored community spectacle. I announced the first annual Electric Eel Educational Experience, a weekend event open to local schools, science clubs, and conservation group. Free admission, live feed demonstrations, a mobile aquarium on loan from my DNR contact, and a lecture from an actual marine biologist. I spread the word through real estate agents, schools, farmers markets, even the city newsletter. My pasture turned into a festival site. We had booths, food trucks, crafts for kids, and a stage where the local high school band played under a banner that read, "Shocking Science." The turnout was insane. I'd expected a few dozen people. We got hundreds. Families came from 3 counties over. Local reporters showed up with cameras. Parents snapped selfies with the educational eel tank. Kids gasped at the zapping demonstration using LED strips and rubber gloves. And right in the middle of it all, in a folding chair beneath a canopy, I sat and smiled, shaking hands and accepting compliments from city council members I'd never even met. Karen showed up, of course. She parked across the road, just outside my property line, wearing giant sunglasses and holding a clipboard like she might file a report on the whole event. But when she saw the sheriff posing for photos next to the mobile eel tank, she didn't step a foot closer. She didn't even try. I thought that might be the end. I hoped it was. But then Monday morning rolled around, and I got a knock on the door from a code enforcement officer I hadn't seen before. He was polite, uncomfortable, and holding a folder with freshly printed forms. "I'm here on a complaint," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Allegation is that you hosted a public event without proper commercial permits." I nodded. It was an educational outreach, not a commercial event. No tickets were sold. It was by donation only, and all proceeds went to the DNR. He flipped a few pages. "They're also claiming the pond is being used as a for-profit venue, and that you're housing dangerous animals without the correct containment." I invited him in, offered coffee, and let him watch the footage. I showed him my permits, the DNR partnership letter, the conservation habitat notice signed by the regional director. His eyebrows climbed higher with every piece of paperwork. "This is actually impressive," he muttered. Then I handed him the printed HOA newsletter Karen had sent out the month before, the one claiming the pond was an exciting new community amenity. He whistled. "Looks like she tried to claim it when she thought it was hers, then called it dangerous when she realized she couldn't have it." "Exactly." He closed the folder. "Don't worry. I'll mark this as resolved. But you might want to get ahead of this. They're going to keep trying." So I did. I went nuclear. I filed a formal civil complaint against the HOA for harassment, malicious interference, and trespass. Then I filed a motion to have a restraining order issued against Karen and Melody for unlawful entry and wildlife endangerment. I didn't expect the order to be granted. It wasn't, but it made it into the public record. That was enough. Because what Karen didn't realize was that while she'd been busy trying to bully me off my own land, I'd been quietly documenting everything. The drone footage, the broken fence, the pond challenge video, even audio recordings from her little ambush with the HOA lawyer. And I wasn't just filing for fun. I had a plan. A week later, I walked into a town hall meeting where Karen was scheduled to present her latest HOA budget amendment. I signed up for the public comment portion, and when it was my turn, I stepped to the microphone, smiled politely, and handed out printed packets to every member of the city council. Inside were timelines, incident reports, photos, quotes, and my formal complaint, complete with references to county codes, state wildlife law, and municipal boundary lines. I spoke calmly, clearly, and without a hint of anger. "I'm not asking for money," I said. "I'm not even asking for punishment. I'm simply requesting protection for private property, for legally designated habitats, and for citizens who are being harassed by an overreaching HOA with no authority over their land." The room was dead silent. Karen's face went pale. Melody had the nerve to scoff from the back row, but nobody was listening to her. Not this time. A week later, the HOA board held a closed-door vote and Karen was removed as president. Melody lost her title as Community Outreach Coordinator. The newsletter was shut down pending review. And the new acting board? They emailed me a formal apology, and asked if I'd be willing to consult on a new HOA boundary map that explicitly excluded my land from all future plans. I told them I'd think about it. Instead, I forwarded the email to the city paper, which ran a story titled, "Local Man Wins Property Dispute Using Electric Eels and Ironclad Logic." The comments section was glorious. But even then, I wasn't quite finished. Because there was one last thing Karen didn't know. She'd spent months trying to claim that my pond was part of her HOA's territory. What she didn't realize, what no one realized, was that I owned more than just that one parcel. A lot more. The pond was just the start. It sat on a 10-acre parcel my grandfather had registered as part of a homestead trust back in the 70s. What Karen didn't know, what she never bothered to check, was that, over the years, He'd quietly bought up the surrounding lots. 5 here, 7 there, a handful bought outright during the recession when developers tried and failed to gentrify this part of the county. On paper, it looked like a patchwork. In practice, it meant I owned a strip of land that snaked around and between nearly every edge of the HOA's sparkling little subdivision. Like a horseshoe. Or a noose. When I got wind that the HOA was planning to expand their walking trail, something they'd pitched as the Serenity Loop, a concrete ribbon meant to foster connectivity with nature, I double-checked the property map. Sure enough, the proposed trail weaved through 4 of my parcels, including one small section that the HOA had been using unofficially as a dog park. Without permission, without lease, and without even a fence to mark the difference. So I did what any polite landowner would do. I put up a gate. Not a padlocked prison-style thing, just a simple, tasteful cattle gate with a sign, private property. No access without written permission. I even installed a solar-powered keypad for authorized entry. No alarms, no threats. Just boundaries. 2 days later, HOA Karen 2.0, some guy named Brett, a former insurance adjuster with a tactical haircut and the charisma of a damp sponge, showed up at my door to negotiate usage rights. He wore hiking boots with no dirt on them and sunglasses that didn't suit his face. I invited him onto the porch but didn't offer him coffee. He launched into a script almost immediately. The trail extension is an important wellness initiative for the community. We'd like to find a way to include your parcels in the project, possibly through an easement or temporary usage license. I asked him why they didn't talk to me before they designed the map and broke ground on the first half of the trail. He ignored that. We're prepared to offer compensation, of course. A one-time fee, plus landscaping services. I let the silence stretch. He shifted in his chair. Look, he said, lowering his voice like we were conspiring. Karen may have overreached, but the HOA is trying to make things right. We want to build bridges. Literally and figuratively. I stood up, dusted my hands, and pointed toward the property line. You want a bridge? Build it somewhere else. And just like that, the last polite conversation with the HOA ended. I wasn't trying to be petty. Not then. But something about the way they refused to acknowledge boundaries, legal, personal, or physical, had triggered a quiet, relentless part of me that I usually kept in check. They didn't want harmony. They wanted control dressed as civility. So I gave them neither. Instead, I went back through my deed book and started marking out the parcels I knew they were crossing. Little patches they'd paved, trimmed, or landscaped without asking. I photographed their signage on my property, counted their benches, traced their irrigation lines. Every inch they'd assumed was theirs. Then I filed notices of encroachment. One for each violation. Not lawsuits. Just formal declarations backed by a land use attorney I hired using funds from my recent Shocking Science event. I sent copies to the city clerk, the zoning board, and the HOA's legal department. Then I waited. The emails started within days. Confused. Defensive. A few begging to work something out. But I didn't respond. I let the silence do the talking while I prepared the next phase. That's when I discovered their clubhouse was on shaky legal ground, literally. See, the HOA's gleaming new Community Engagement Center sat on a parcel adjacent to mine. According to their own website, it was meant to serve as a rental venue, polling station, and office space for board meetings. What they failed to mention, what no one had bothered to check, was that the back third of the building's patio overhung a utility easement that was still legally part of my inherited water rights. And according to state law, any structure that impedes access to those rights is subject to removal or retroactive lease fees. So I sent a final letter. It was short, direct, polite. Effective immediately, you are occupying private land without lease or authorization. You may remove the overhanging portion of the structure within 30 days or negotiate a formal lease agreement for continued access. Failure to comply will result in a civil claim for unlawful encroachment. They thought I was bluffing. So I filed the claim. When the court date landed, I didn't have to say much. The judge reviewed the plat maps, confirmed the easement, and looked mildly irritated as he asked the HOA council why they hadn't verified the boundary lines during construction. Their lawyer tried to blame Karen, then blamed the contractor, then suggested I was weaponizing obscure land use laws. The judge raised an eyebrow. You mean the ones printed in every zoning guide in the county? By the end of the week, the HOA was forced to pay me $14,000 in retroactive lease fees and was ordered to either modify the structure or continue paying annually. They chose to pay. I donated half the amount to a local conservation group and made sure the city paper knew it. And still, they didn't stop. They started a whisper campaign. The new HOA newsletter included a column titled, "The Cost of Conflict," filled with vague language about neighbors who exploit technicalities and hostilities disguised as stewardship. Someone posted flyers claiming I was installing hazardous electric systems that endangered children. My mailbox got smashed twice. My tire pressure monitor caught a slow leak in my truck. I documented everything. And then I made my final move. Remember those parcels I mentioned earlier? The ones I'd inherited and quietly maintained? Well, one of them sat between their clubhouse and their only vehicle-accessible service road. For years, the HOA had used it like it was a public path. Technically, it was a long gravel drive with 2 crumbling culverts, but legally, it was mine. So I sold it. Not to the HOA. To a rural farming co-op that specialized in heritage pig breeding. They were thrilled. Told me they'd been looking for land close to town. The moment they took ownership, they installed a new fence, hung a giant future home of hickory swine preserve banner, and set up temporary housing for 3 massive breeding boars. Karen showed up the next day. She looked 10 years older. Tired. Defeated. Her clipboard was gone, replaced by a sun hat and a brittle smile. "You win," she said softly. I nodded. "I wasn't trying to." "Yes, you were," she replied. "But it was justified." We stood there for a long moment, watching one of the pigs grunt and flop into a puddle. I think we both understood that there was no going back. Not to civility. Not to polite neighborhood waves. Not even to neutral silence. But there was something else too. Peace. Because for the first time in months, Karen didn't try to argue. She didn't threaten. She didn't smile while sharpening a knife behind her back. She just turned, walked back across the boundary line, and left me standing alone. Surrounded by electric eels, swine preservationists, and more legal leverage than I'd ever imagined owning. And I still hadn't used my best card. Because that patch of woods behind her house? That was mine too. I waited 2 more weeks before doing anything. Let the dust settle. Let Karen think the war was over and that she'd lost with some dignity left intact. The pigs were still grunting happily in their new preserve. The pond was tranquil again, its eels thriving under the watchful eye of my game cameras and some fresh signage from the DNR. And me? I kept to myself. Planted tomatoes. Fixed a rusted hinge on the barn. Even waved to a couple of HOA folks who dared make eye contact while walking their dogs along the newly fenced perimeter of their shrinking world. Then I received an envelope in the mail, hand-delivered, no postage, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed message. What kind of person keeps a forest just to prove a point? I laughed harder than I had in months. The patch of woods she was talking about, 40 acres of second-growth forest behind the HOA development, had belonged to my grandfather since the early 80s. Most people assumed it was public or part of some forgotten greenbelt, especially since the walking trails behind the HOA houses tiptoed along its edge. But the title was clear. I'd inherited it like everything else, and until now it had served me well as a buffer zone. Quiet. Private. Untouched. But now it was time to use it. See, over the last year, I'd been talking with a nonprofit that focused on veteran rehabilitation through wilderness programs. They ran nature retreats, hunting trips, and equine therapy sessions for service members struggling with PTSD. All they needed was land. I had land. And thanks to Karen, I also had motivation. We struck a deal. I wouldn't sell. I'd lease it to them for $1 a year. They'd build modest structures, eco-cabins, a lodge and stables, and in return, they'd maintain the trails and host quiet, low-impact programs that brought peace to people who actually needed it. They broke ground one morning with little fanfare, just a few trucks, a tractor, and a team of veterans in dusty boots and ballcap. They worked fast and politely. No music. No disruption. Just progress. Karen noticed by day 2. She stormed down the property line in yoga pants and a fanny pack, tried to confront the project lead, an ex-Marine named Leo with shoulders like an aircraft carrier and the patience of a monk. She demanded to see permit, asked if he was with the city, told him he was causing emotional distress to nearby residents. Leo just smiled, handed her a brochure about the program, and offered to let her speak with their legal coordinator. Karen never even took the paper. She just glared, snapped a photo, and marched back across her lawn like she thought someone might follow. Spoiler alert, no one did. The next week was an all-out blitz. She filed complaints with the city council, sent emails to the zoning board, tried to paint the rehab retreat as a private militia camp. One local paper printed her quote, "We just want to make sure these woods aren't being turned into something dangerous for our children." 3 days later, the same paper ran a follow-up with Leo's interview and pictures of veterans building trails and sitting around a fire pit. The headline read, "Healing in the Heartland, Local Heroes Build Peace in the Pines." Karen's credibility took a hit so loud you could hear it from my porch. But even that wasn't the end. In a final act of desperation, the HOA, egged on by whatever loyalty Karen had left, voted to build a fence. Not just a privacy fence. A barrier. 8 feet tall, wrought iron with faux Gothic points, running the full length of their properties that bordered my woods. They called it a security enhancement and spent over $60,000 on it. They installed it over the course of 2 weeks, each day louder and more ridiculous than the last. One of the work crews even had matching shirts that said Fort Suburbia. I couldn't tell if it was sarcasm or marketing. I let them build it, let them seal themselves in, and then I hosted the retreat's first open day. Invited local press, gave the mayor a tour, showed off the clean, natural trails and the picnic areas dotted with wildflowers. There were no weapons, no bunkers, no screaming drill sergeants, just calm people doing calm things, healing in the way that the city never offered them. The mayor made a speech, called it a model of rural cooperation. Karen watched the whole thing from a second-floor window, face barely visible behind lace curtains. A few days later, a new letter arrived in my mailbox. This one had a return address, HOA letterhead, Brett's signature. It read, "Dear Mr. Fulton, on behalf of the Meadow Pines Homeowners Association, we'd like to formally acknowledge and respect your property rights and offer a sincere apology for past tensions. We hope to begin a new chapter of mutual understanding and peaceful coexistence." Attached was a formal retraction of all complaints, including the false wildlife endangerment claims and a check for the fence damage from months prior, something Karen had once vowed they'd never pay on principle. I didn't cash the check. I mailed it back with a handwritten note, "Keep it. Use it to fix your newsletter's grammar." It wasn't about the money anymore. Hadn't been for a long time. Later that month, I sat by the pond, calm water, soft light, no lawn chairs or inflatable flamingos in sight, and watched a group of kids from the retreat paint a sign for the main trail. It said Thunder Path, in thick block letters with a cartoon eel wriggling underneath. Leo asked if I wanted to name it something more formal. "Nope," I said. "That'll do just fine." We both laughed. A few yards away, the eels shimmered beneath the surface like silent sentries. Unbothered. Untouchable. Just like the land they swam in. A year passed. The HOA settled down. Brett resigned and moved to Florida. Karen stayed, but rarely left the house. The fence started rusting by fall. No one bothered to repaint it. Melody moved in with her boyfriend 3 towns over. Last I heard, he managed a vape shop and believed he was descended from pirates. And me? I expanded the retreat. Added cabins. A greenhouse. Even a zip line through the upper trees that made the kids scream with joy. The pigs thrived. The eels stayed healthy. The land flourished. But every now and then, when the air is still and the clouds hang low, I think about that first moment. That ridiculous image of a grown woman in a unicorn floatie casting her line like she owned the world. And I realize something. They never wanted the pond. Not really. They wanted to prove they could take something that wasn't theirs. And I wanted to prove they couldn't. Turns out, electric eels weren't the real shock in the end. It was how quickly a cairn collapses when the current turns legal.